took an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States of America. By some, he's been called controversial.
I'll keep my freedom, I'll keep my guns, try to keep my money and my religion too. Now, keep in mind that some of my guests have been approached by, Homeland Security or FBI saying, why are you going on the Clay Douglas show?
My message to those guys, if they're listening this morning, is go get a cup of coffee. Maybe you'll learn something.
We both took the same oath, to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I don't recall there being an expiration date on that. I'm going to keep my big BA, keep my friends the same, keep the government out of my business, and y'all can keep the change.
He is the free American, Clay Douglas.
We know what we need, we know who to blame.
Catch the Free American Hour, weekdays at 7 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Eastern.
I'll keep the USA, and y'all can keep the change.
For the podcast and more details, visit www.freeamerican.com or catch the podcast by phone by calling 832-999-8621.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of the Free American Hour. I'm your host, Clay Douglas. And today's a holiday, Labor Day. Monday, 3rd of September. Folks, I've been doing this a long time, and I've always been looking for answers, looking for ways to confront and solve some of the problems we got with this country, with this world today. And a long time ago, I came up with an idea called Liberty Villages. I had 5 acres in Arizona, out in the middle of nowhere, out in the middle of the ranches, and I had wonderful steaks. I had wonderful food. I had a garden, and people would come out. People came out, and I would, some of them stayed there. Matter of fact, I got to have dinner the other day with Farrell, who stayed out on my property for a long time, back when I was still married, when we had publications out, when we had the Free American in every bookstore across the country, every Barnes and Noble across the country. 10,000 copies. That went to zero very quickly after I started publishing information, after I started putting information in my motorcycle, my first motorcycle magazine, almost 25 years ago, about Operation Watchtower. Just a document somebody, a Vietnam vet, handed me in Sturgis. And I published it. I thought it was pretty interesting. I checked it out, and it was true. It was accurate. They talked about somebody getting put in prison, somebody's wife being killed, somebody going to trial for it. And I found the person that went to trial for that. I found the person that went to prison for that through his mother. I documented that Colonel Edward P. Catolo's Operation Watchtower was absolutely accurate. It was absolutely accurate. Everything I called it, George Bush, drugs, George Bush, and the CIA. And this was the story that, it actually made headlines. It actually made headlines. And back in early 70s, I guess. Talking about Ricky Ross, the crack epidemic, and basically they totally ignored the whole concept of being honest here. I've told you, folks, I've told you that the war on drugs, before the war on terror, there was a war on drugs. That was a war on the American people. They were doing to the American people exactly what they did to the Chinese in the 20s. And some of the people that we all met about this. Michael Rupert is featured in this film, and he was a friend of mine. We met at the Wake Up America meetings, where we brought in Mark Carnegie, where we brought in Senator Charlie Duke, where we brought in speakers like that, and we educated. And I still wasn't aware at that time that Bill Clinton and George Bush and possibly even Ronald Reagan were all involved in the drug trade. Now, in addition to this, we talked about the Federal Reserve, we talked about the control, we talked about all that. And we wanted people to know. We wanted people to know about this. And we tried to tell people. I rented a motorcycle magazine, and I rented the Free American. And the pressure started being put on me. And it was also being put on Bill Cooper, and they were successful in killing him. They tried to kill me. They've tried to kill Michael Rupert. Just to give you a little
Boys
sample.
in the Hood, where Larry Fishburne is saying, hey man,
This is Michael Rupert, who has left the country because of the threats on his life. I believe the name of his website was from the wilderness, and he's talking about Gary Webb, who broke this story, was demoted by his newspaper, San Jose Mercury, driven out of journalism by his colleagues. And the Washington Post, New York Times, and Wall Street Journal, and San Francisco Examiner all ran multi-page stories discrediting him. And Webb later committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. Twice. And this is why Michael Rupert left the country. Maybe it's why I should have left the country, but I know we're in a war, and I simply won't quit.
We don't grow it. We don't own any airplanes.
Michael Rupert.
We don't have any laboratories. How does it get here? Why does it get here? And that's a very good common sense approach that intuitively the people in South Central understood, that there was something much bigger than them that was moving the whole drug issue and the drug war.
My parents were staunch Republicans. Back in the 80s, the big concern was not terrorism, it was communism. The Iran-Contra affair was one of the biggest political scandals in U.S. history. Members of the Reagan administration, headed by Oliver North, engaged in the sale of arms to Iran. The proceeds from these illegal deals were being used to fund the Contras, a right-wing guerrilla group that Reagan referred to as his freedom fighters. The Contras were fighting the Soviet-backed Sandinistas for the domination of Nicaragua.
The Iran-Contra is very important in history. We have to remember the fact that Iran-Contra, its mandate was to investigate the sales of missiles to Iran.
Former DEA agent Celerino Castillo not only fought in the international effort of the American drug war, he also had the rare opportunity of carrying a camera and recording some of the regrettable actions of the DEA and CIA while they supported President Reagan and Oliver North's Contra movement.
George Bush Sr. came to Guatemala on January 13, 1986, and he approached me and asked me what I did there at the U.S. Embassy, what my job description was, and I told him I was a DEA agent working international narcotics investigations, and I told him, look, you know, we have gathered intelligence that the Contras are involved in drug trafficking down in El Salvador. And then he just smiled, shook my hand, and walked away from me. And it was then and there that I knew that my government knew that these atrocities were occurring.
That was the former DEA agent, Rene Castillo, talking about approaching George Bush and telling him that, you know, I spoke with William Tyree back when I got the information on Operation Watchtower almost over 20 years ago, when he was still and still is in prison on a life sentence. They murdered his wife, framed him for the murder, and I was talking to him. I had him on my radio show back when I had an 800 number and he could call in. And I told him that I had sent information to Bill Clinton about Operation Watchtower, about Iran-Contra, about Oliver North, about George Bush, and he started laughing at me. He said, he'll never use that. He'll never use that. He was part of it. He worked for George Bush, just like Manuel Noriega. And you get more things. There was a Jewish doctor that helped start the crack cocaine, okay? Not just Ricky Ross. It was a Jewish doctor who started the freebase kit, made the freebase kit, which was how Ricky Ross got the information on how to make crack cocaine. And of course, this was all funded by the CIA. CIA and Mossad met the planes, and this is a whole chapter in Operation Watchtower. It's one of the reasons they don't really want you to read my book. It also has my book, Mystery Babylon, The New World Order Unveiled, has the whole story about the history of the Rothschilds, the banking industry here. The banking and the drugs are all hand in hand, along with the manufacturers of our depleted uranium weapons. Come on, folks. I mean, this is such an obvious thing that it just blows my mind that we can think of it. We can't, the average Americans basically can't handle the truth. They just can't. And it's why when you bring it to, and this clip here that I've got on the bogus drug war, actually there's a couple of parts, and this is all up on Brass Check TV. But here we got a reporter that exposed the CIA connection to Ricky Ross. Here's Ricky Ross' co-conspirator, Chico Brown, talking about exactly what's happening here.
I'm concerned about giving the guns to Iran and all that stuff. The question should have been asked about all that cocaine flying back over here.
In 1986, on American TV, we were all being fed a steady diet of:
we're taking down the surrender flag that has flown over so many drug efforts. We're running up a battle flag.
This scourge will stop.
But regrettably, back in Central America and in the jungle,
I remember down in Central America, we were refueling planes full of cocaine coming into the U.S., and it was a CIA operation being run by the White House.
at the same time all of the cocaine from Nicaragua was flowing into the U.S., Freeway Ricky Ross was at his heyday.
The average week would at least be $2 to $3 million, almost guaranteed. Some days we would have $2 and $3 million days.
After Freeway Rick was arrested, an investigative journalist by the name of Gary Webb uncovered a link that connected him back to the Nicaraguan Contra movement.
So I read Dark Alliance. I got a copy personally from Gary Webb himself. And to read the book, it was fascinating for me, you know, to find out that I was connected with the CIA and all these high-powered people up in the government.
Ricky Ross was just lucky. He just happened to get a source who was connected to the CIA.
For a long time in South Central, the buzzword was that the CIA was selling crack. I said, no, the CIA wasn't selling crack. The CIA was importing cocaine. Ricky Ross got it, turned it into crack, and he sold it.
According to Gary Webb's Dark Alliance, when Danilo Blandón was displaced from his home country of Nicaragua, he set off to America to raise money to aid the Contras in ridding his home from the invading Sandinistas. When Ricky Ross was introduced to Blandón, Blandón was in a position to create a pipeline of cocaine that he in turn gave to Ricky Ross on consignment.
Which I like the sound of that, you know, because I was always trying to get to the top anyway.
Suddenly, some major sources opened up for him. Danilo Blandón, Norwood Meneses, both of whom were tied to the CIA and the Contras, and Gary Webb did a masterful job of breaking those stories and proving with documents that that was the case.
Whatever we were running in there, he was the profit. He was going to the Contra.
That's right.
And Ricky Ross says, I started doing a little research on my own, I'd read a little bit about Oliver
Doing a
North.
little research on my own, I read a little bit about Oliver North and the Contras, because I never knew what the Contras was before.
There's legends of Oliver North and them actually transporting the cocaine to our country. There's film. Every piece of documentation possible.
Talk about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. First-time dealer and former Crip, Leroy Chico Brown, was arrested with Rick. Chico walked into a DEA sting operation that was set up to capture and imprison Rick and trade for Rick's old partner, Danilo Blandone.
How could this be possible? And we read through the documents, and then that's when Gary Webb started explaining it to us, and we was like, everything came together now.
One of the most paramount moments, perhaps caused by Gary Webb's Dark Alliance, took place in November of 1996.
It was a monumental historic event. I mean,
This was 2 years, rather, after I started the Free American. And I was working, when I started the Free American, with all of the people that you're talking to. I'd even ran into Barry Seal in the years before I started the Free American. See what we got here. Yeah, okay. You know, folks, I don't care how many people are listening on Blog TV. I'm sure we're being blocked. I'm sure it's the show, but we record the show. We put it up on the website and we put it up on YouTube, and so it doesn't matter how many people are listening here. And I don't. The only people and the people that are coming here are the people that simply want to distract from the message, folks. Now, there are answers. We are, you know, I've been struggling with this whole drug dealing thing for a long time. You know, they're putting pretty much innocent kids in jail. In Texas, I mean, you can still get 99 years for having a little bit of pot on you. You know, but in 16 states, since I started the Free American, we've got, it's legal to smoke some pot, to own some pot. So we're making progress. There is more progress to be made. I will talk about that in the second half of this part. But I want you to understand that this drug war and the war on terror, it's a distraction. They want you to be afraid. They want you to, but the drug dealing, they took it over from the top down. That's the way it works. You know, I'm sure that most of the DEA agents, other than Rene Casilio, didn't know that George Bush was the mastermind behind this. The mastermind behind. Now,
the director of the Central Intelligence Agency was coming to watch the face the people.
Now, we all know that the U.S. government and the CIA supported the Contras in their efforts to overthrow the Sandinista government in Nicaragua in the middle 80s.
Now you're listening to the voice of John Deutch, D-E-U-T-C-H, CIA director back in the 90s. And I believe this is about 1996.
Now, it is alleged the CIA also helped the Contras raise money for arms by introducing crack cocaine into California.
Deutsch felt he had to do something to try to deal with the outrage that was...
Now this is Michael Rupert speaking. Again, somebody I knew personally before he left the country.
Foaming all over the country at the time, and of course it just blew up in his face.
CIA fights drugs. CIA does not encourage drugs.
So I mean, it was actually one of the most monumental blunders of all time, if you think about it.
We have no evidence of a conspiracy by the CIA to engage in encouraging drug traffickers in Nicaragua or elsewhere in Latin America.
Deutsch was there because of the Gary Webb stories. The Gary Webb stories had sparked a national furor.
I would like to have Richie Ross's brother to speak, please.
The United States government turned their head and let this cocaine come into the United States of America.
allowed Gary Webb to have full access. This whole thing is orchestrated.
It was near pandemonium. It was about, I guess, 1,200 people standing room only in the auditorium, 2,000 people outside listening on loudspeakers. And it was very hard to keep control. I got called on finally, and I said to her very clearly, I'm looking right at Deutsch. I am a former Los Angeles police narcotics detective, and I worked South Central Los Angeles, and I will tell you, Director Deutsch, that the agency has dealt drugs throughout this country for a long time. I was able to name operations. Director Deutsch, I will refer you to 3 specific agency operations known as Amadeus, Pegasus, and Watchtower. I have Watchtower documents heavily redacted by the agency. I was personally exposed to CIA operations and recruited by CIA personnel who attempted to recruit me in the late 70s to become involved in protecting agency drug operations in this country.
I was offered the same thing. If you work for us, you won't have any problem. If you don't work for us, we'll see that you end up in prison. Well, they kept their promise. They kept their end of it. They did that. All right. That is, and in my motorcycle magazine, before 1994, while I was still in Miami, I ran the story of Operation Watchtower that you just heard former narcotics officer talk about. It's a frightening thing when you start getting into this, because there's no way out. There's no one to turn to. Somebody offers you a deal, you go to tell somebody, and you just told their boss. You just told their boss that you know what they are. Now, it's going on further, folks. Let me give you another little clip here. This is an interview with Douglas Valentine, who has done a story, did an interview about this endless war on drugs. And for the next chapter here, this is the next chapter, folks. This is the next chapter, and you might have found out about it first here when I had Larry Pratt on. I was doing an interview with Larry Pratt talking about Operation Gun Runner, and this is the CIA. Now, this is Douglas Valentine, author of several books also, confirming everything that I've told you about the CIA, the Mossad. They don't talk about the Mossad. Even in these hearings, they didn't talk about the Mossad. And Colonel Edward Picatola, who was commanding Operation Watchtower, the whole I got a whole chapter in my book dedicated to him. And he told us that Manuel Noriega was working with the CIA. Mossad had an operative right in Manuel Noriega's office. His name was Michael Harari, and all of that is in Mystery Babylon, which is available on Amazon. It's available everywhere. Amazon and Kindle. You can read the whole book, almost 500 pages. And this is the next step in this endless war on drugs.
Hi, welcome to Brass Check TV. This is Tim McCarthy. And we have a special guest today, Douglas Valentine. Douglas. Hi, welcome to Brass Check TV. This is Ken McCarthy, and we have a special guest today, Douglas Valentine. Douglas.
One of his books is called Strength of the Pack.
I hope that I can help educate people a little bit about the things you want to talk about.
Great. And the reason I have Douglas on today is his extreme expertise in the area of U.S. drug policy, so-called policy. Many of us are vaguely aware of strange things going on in Afghanistan, and strange things that happened during Iran-Contra, and strange...
You got a shot of Time magazine probing the mess.
Vietnam. Actually, the rabbit hole goes very far and very deep, and Doug is one of the...
He's talking about Douglas Valentine.
Understanding how all this stuff works. He's the author of many books, but I'm going to ask him to mention 3 just off the top before we get into today's topic, which is the strange goings-on in Mexico. Douglas, you've written 3 books that are particularly interesting on this topic. One on the Phoenix program. Could you give us the title of that?
It's called the Phoenix program.
Ah, easy mnemonic. This is considered the history of the Phoenix program. So if you've ever heard about it, or even if you haven't heard about it, it was a vast program that we can't get into on this show. The U.S. operated in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. It involved detention of uncharged victims. It involved torture. It involved all the kinds of things that we're seeing today under the rubric of defense against terrorism. Doug also wrote 2 really important books about the history of drug law enforcement in the U.S. And I've got one of them here. The book is called The Strength of the Wolf. You wrote another book on this topic called The Strength of the Pack.
Yeah, The Strength of the Pack, and it's basically the sequel.
Okay, so The Strength of the Wolf and The Strength of the Pack, and these are definitive histories on all the agencies that have been involved in drug enforcement and all the strange things that have been going on. And we're going to talk about how far back these strange things go. The story that we're going to talk about today is Operation Drugwar1 and Fast and Furious. And these on the surface appear to be careless gun running operations or gun ATF enforcement investigative operations relating to Mexico. I'm going to give some detailed background on these operations, and I'm going to ask Doug for his perspective. And one of the problems that we have, I think it's obvious to everyone, but it bears repeating, is that we don't have an news media in the United States. Either they don't report a story or they ridicule a topic so that anybody...
All right, let me just stop you for just a second here. And we just had a little bit of problems getting hooked up with Crusade. So we're hooked up on Crusade. The first 30 minutes of that you can pull off of Blog Talk Radio. And we got to keep... sorry that we got tied up there, but we've got that working now. We got that everything working now. Sorry about that, Crusade. But again, go to freeamerican.com. You can hear the whole show. What we're talking about is the bogus drug war here. Bogus drug war. And we've already heard from Ricky Ross. We've already heard from Michael Rupert, who left the country, just reporting on the same thing that I reported on in Mystery Babylon, that I ran in the Free American, that I ran in the Motorcycle Magazine, Writers Exchange, before that.
Is even interested in it, is made to look ridiculous, or when they do report, it's fragmentary. So you get a little piece here, a little piece there, no historical context, no weaving together of the entire picture, so nobody ever knows what's going on. So it's kind of hard to have a democracy or some kind of enlightened country when no one knows what's going on and the foxes are in charge of the henhouse. So, quick background on this stuff going on in Mexico. It started under the Bush administration and it continued under the Obama